Andy Austin. Now, before we get into the stuff that I'm going to tell you about, let me just please do the quick promotional bit. If you want to find my details, and I am going to give these to you at the end of this video, go to www.andrewtaustin.com. It's really easy to remember because it's my name. That's all the W's, andrewtaustin.com. Now, this is what we're going to talk about this morning, or this afternoon, or tonight, whichever time zone you're in. Metaphors. Now, I was a hypnotherapist. I was a hypnotherapist. In hypnotherapy, in therapy, in counseling, in psychotherapy, there's a strong tradition of storytelling. Stories, stories, stories. When I trained, it was almost like what you're supposed to do is you put the client into a trance. You talk to them in a melodic kind of way. You put them under, they go in deep, they sit there with their arm in the air to assure you that they're in a trance. And basically you tell them a story. Now, there's all sorts of stories that get told. Some of them are a little bit patronizing. Some of them are deep-rooted, complicated, isomorphic, polymorphic, multimorphic, unbelievably morphic stories that inside there will have embedded commands. There will also be inside there hidden meanings, double meanings, multiple meanings, all sorts of meanings. The idea being that somehow the deep unconscious mind interprets the story and comes up with a solution. Now, as entertainment, storytelling to me seemed to be fantastic. We go to the movies, go to the theatre, go to, all that kind of stuff. But it just seemed that the repeated storytelling that went on in therapy, whilst being very clever and technically brilliant, just didn't seem all that effective to me. So I started looking at what can we actually do with the stories and the metaphors that people tell. How can we work with this material in a way that's actually much more meaningful? And then one windy afternoon in Chichester in West Sussex on the south coast of England, I met Charles Faulkner. Charles started telling me about all sorts of interesting little things, and initially I was a little bit confused, and I started thinking about what he said, and I started paying attention. And I think it's quite possible that I was paying attention to things for the very first time. I started listening to what people said, and rather than inflict a story upon my client, I started listening more to the client's story. And I noticed that client stories that they bring to therapy have a number of themes to them. Most commonly, the story they tell is about their suffering. They will tell you how they feel. They're going to, I feel terrible, these are the feelings that happen, and these are, I feel depressed, and I don't like what's happening to me, and I just don't feel like I can move forward in my life, and things like that. So an awful lot of feelings are in the story. There's also the story of the consequences that their problems have upon their life. The things that it limits them from being able to do, the problems that it creates. For example, I get up in the morning and I just can't face the world. I have difficulty holding down relationships. So they'll tell very much a story about the consequences. Sometimes the story will revolve around the content and examples of what happens in their life. So it will be things like, just this morning my father shouted at me yet again. Last year I had a terrible time at work. Let me tell you about what happened. So they'll go very much into the content of what happens. Or they will give you the diagnosis of the story. So basically, what do we call this? How do we analyze this? What's the framework that we actually place upon the experience? If they're of a philosophical bent, they will actually go into what all of this means. So the suffering brings meaning, and then there's the philosophical discourse. That is what I noticed was discussed most of the time in therapy, both in my therapy and in other people's therapy sessions. But there were other little things inside those stories that were worth paying attention to. People would say stuff like, I don't feel like I'm going anywhere. I just feel like something holds me back. I feel trapped. And they would start to give information that are like metaphors. They're like little idioms, little figures of speech, little things that don't get given too much attention. That actually, if we pay attention to them, we can start to understand things quite differently. And I'm going to give you some examples over on this board here. This is my favourite one. This is one of the first ones that I actually noticed when I first started really listening to what people said. A gentleman came to see me and he was depressed. And he looked depressed. He was clearly a guy who drank a lot of alcohol. He didn't look all that healthy. And he was very clearly a very unhappy and depressed individual. So I said to him, okay, what's the problem? And of course he said, well, I'm depressed. So I said, okay, what's really the problem? And he said, I'm really depressed. So I said, okay, so you're really depressed. What is that like for you? And what he said to me was, it's like I'm in the pit of despair. Now, I hear that as a potential for a story. So I said, okay, this pit of despair, tell me what it is you want from me. He said, well, I want you to help me move forwards. So I said, so what happens when you try and move forwards yourself? And he said, it's like I just take one step and I hit a brick wall. I said, then what happens? He said, well, that's when I get drunk. So I said, let me draw you a picture. This is what I drew. I said, it's like you in the pit of despair. He said, that pretty much sums it up. And I said, you've come all this way today because you want help to move forwards. Because you couldn't get moving forwards to work for yourself, so you want me to help you move forwards. I said, can you see what's wrong with this picture? He said, I think so. And I said, now just imagine that you and we're walking down a very strange road. As we go down this strange road, we find a terrible thing. There's this poor man, he's in the pit of despair. Don't worry, we know exactly what he should do. Go, don't you worry, sir. Just go forwards, forwards. And when he bounces off the wall there, we'll just throw him a bottle of whiskey. I said, well, that seemed like sensible advice. And he laughed and he said, no, that'll be ridiculous. Now, this is what's going on here. The gentleman that came to see me was going to tell me the story. And he was going to tell me the story of a guy, him, and how he suffers inside that pit of despair. He could tell me things like, he feels very low. I'm going to pun a little bit here. He feels very low, he feels down. He could even feel down in the dumps. He's in hell, he's in a hellhole. He's in the pit of despair. Life's the pits. He could tell me that he feels cut off from everybody else. He doesn't feel like he's going anywhere. He doesn't feel like he's making any progress. He could be moving around in very, very tight circles. It could be like he tries to take some steps to help himself, but it's always like there's something in his way, and any which way he turns, there's no way out of this. He could tell me he feels trapped, that he's just not making any progress. In short, he could tell me those 4 things that most people talk about in therapy. How he feels about being in this situation. He could tell me the consequences of being in this situation. He could tell me examples of what this is, examples from his everyday life, his personal history, or he could give the clinical diagnosis, which his clinical diagnosis was, oh, you're depressed. And think about this one. The person goes to the doctor and says, I feel very low, I feel trapped, I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. I feel like I'm completely cut off from everyone else, I feel very low, I'm in a dark place right now. That sounds like depression. Or it just sounds like he's in a pit of despair, and that's what the pit is like. So the most stories that people tell in therapy are about the experience of the story, but actually the story itself is missing. And then all too often therapists will then come in and try and work with, they'll tell an isomorphic story about a man who felt trapped and very down, but it was okay because one day he realized that he could be free and fly like a bird. But if we pull out details of the pit of despair, so we find out how deep that is, how wide it is, we pull out more and more details. What's up here, over here, what's over here, what's over this side, what's over that side. We can start to discover the context in which that happens. And of course, what's happening here is he's trying to move forwards. That's not going to work. Moving forwards from this position simply won't work. Let me give you another example. I've got to clear that off first though. Now, one lady came to see me. This was actually in a film studio. We were doing some film sessions. We were just looking at what are the patterns. I wanted to show some of my peer group some of the work that I was doing. Now, when this lady arrived, she was already crying and she was already in tears. And I asked her, okay, so what's the problem? And she said words pretty much to the effect of, I don't want to talk about it. So I said, then don't talk about it. Just tell me what your situation's like. And pardon my French here. She said, I'm in it up to here in the... I said, you're in it up to here in the... She said, yeah. I said, what kind of... She said, all that other people keep throwing at me. I said, that sounds terrible. She said, I said, how do you deal with this? She said, the only way that I can. I keep my mouth shut and I wait for things to get better. I said, let me draw you a picture. I said, is that your situation? And she said, well, she kind of laughed and said, yeah, that pretty much sums it up. So I said, again, now imagine we're walking down a strange road. And what we find down this strange road is a very horrible thing. There's this poor woman up to here in all that other people have thrown at her. It's all right then. We know exactly what she should do. We go, don't you worry, love. Just keep your mouth shut and wait. Would that seem like good advice? And of course she laughed and said, no, that'd be ridiculous. So again, we have the beginnings of a story. And the story that we've got is working very much with the idioms, the cliches, the metaphors, those little figures of speech that often don't get given much attention, even by the speaker themselves, because we can start to pull out information. So we know how the person lives their life. They keep their mouth shut and wait. But when they're in it up to here in something unmentionable, keeping your mouth shut and waiting probably isn't such a good plan. I mean, she complains her life stinks. She gets that sinking feeling. She finds that everybody avoids her. No one gets close to her. She seems to be wading through stuff and she's just constantly, she's fed up with it. She finds it exhausting. She struggles to keep her head up. When we pull out the story of what's going on with regards to this, everything starts to change. So this is what the metaphors of movement work is about. We take those little speeches, those little sentences, the little fragments, which often don't even get heard. I mean, I didn't hear them, that's the thing. It's a phenomenon I call shouting at the deaf, because they say it so clearly. Here was one of my other favourite examples. A couple came to see me. He and she. And I kind of got the feeling they probably didn't need me. They needed a lawyer. There was just something in the air that said these two people weren't very happy. Now, he said, I want this relationship to move forwards. And I keep trying to push things forwards, but she resists me. And she said, I feel I'm right on edge, and he's going to push me over the edge. Now, they both said those words pretty much, my paraphrasing of their words, pretty clearly to each other. Yet both were saying things very clearly, but neither could hear the other. He's trying to push forwards, and she's on edge. And the edge, by the way, when I pulled out, what's the edge like? It was as though it was like she's standing on this like cliff edge, and it goes left to right, and it's a huge, great drop, and she's right on the edge. And she feels very nervous. She's always very edgy. She feels, uncertain. And of course, he's trying to push her forwards, and she's resisting. He pushes harder. She resists more, and she's frightened that he's going to push her over the edge. That was quite clear, but of course they didn't hear it. It was like shouting at the deaf. So when we start to hear these little figures of speech, these little idioms, metaphors, cliches, whatever people like to call them, and I know they will have definitions, but they are just little phrases that actually are metaphors. They're fragments of a story, just little fragments. We can start to extrapolate enormous amounts of information. This is the last example before I leave you. I need to find my little rubber thing again. Another guy phoned me. Now he phoned for an appointment. He sounded pretty despondent, pretty unhappy. Now when he phoned up, he said basically I need to come see you quite soon because I feel like I can't go on. I'm really suffering, and I'm taking medication, and I'm doing all those, I've been having counselling and taking medicine and stuff. But I just feel like life's an uphill struggle. And, the doctors increased the dose of medication, and I heard those words. I just feel like life is an uphill struggle. Life's an uphill struggle. Now, this is where my brain goes. I take that small piece of information in amongst all of the other stuff, the reporting of his suffering. And this is the picture I see in my head. Life's an uphill struggle. Now, this is what I say back to him. So I say, so you're trying to take steps in order to move forward in life. But the steps that you take, that you find them quite difficult. And he went, yeah. And I said, I'm just concerned that you may sometimes find yourself on a bit of a slippery slope, and that you're actually worried about backsliding again. And again, he was in agreement. And that what I picture is that you're trying to get on top of everything. You're trying to go forward in order to basically try and get on top of this problem. And he was like, that's exactly what I want to do. But it's an uphill struggle for you. He said, yeah. And would I be fair to say that sometimes it's like you take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, or whatever that expression is? He said, that's exactly what it is. And he said, I've ground to a halt now. He said, I'm just not moving anymore. Now, I'm communicating entirely in metaphor with him, entirely in story. But the story matches the little fragment that I've got. Now, he's trying to go forward, and his solution, of course, is to try and get on top of everything. But if I change the scale of that, getting on top of everything, just supposing it's like that, and there he is on top, the difficulty with that, whilst he may feel like he's on top, sometimes he can be lonely at the top. He may feel like he's got the world at his feet, but of course the only way then is down, and depending on the nature of that hill, then in order to make any further progress, he has to come back down. And sometimes coming back down to earth, whilst can be a very useful thing, could be actually problematic. People don't like that. So he's doing this thing about getting on top. So I suggested to him that actually we need to change what he's doing. We need to change the story that he lives by. And he was like, yeah. And I said, well, moving forwards, this uphill struggle for you just doesn't seem to be working. And I can see that you're trying to get on top, but you're just not able to get that to work. So you want me to help you? He said, yes. I said, I'm not prepared to do that. I have to tell you. I think it's going to be better that you change direction. And the direction I think you should go is the right way. That's the opposite to left, by the way. He's moving forwards uphill. Maybe he needs to go the right way around this, or the right way about this. And he said, I like the sound of that. So that's what all this is about. It's just basically start paying close attention to those little phrases, those little fragments of stories, because we can start to build a much bigger and better story when we actually start listening for the first time. Now, I've put up a website. It's the promotional bit. The website, www.metaphorsofmovement.com. That's all the W's, metaphorsofmovement.com. And you'll find lots of examples on there. I put up lots of articles and pages, and there's some videos as well, similar to this one that goes into different kind of detail. Also, if you want to contact me, I'm a therapist based on the south coast of the UK. My website, again, all the W's, andrewtaustin.com, and I'm wishing you a fantastic day.